Hello.
I will stay without the camera because the video, because the internet connection is failing a lot. If necessary, I link the video, but most of the time it will be switched off.
That's fine.
Okay, should we start maybe?
Yes. Oh, now I can't change the slide. Oh, like this. Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome. There's still people. I'm Priscilla Malacari, and this is the webinar Introduction to Directed Acyclic Graphs, also known as DAGs, for causal inference. I will be presenting this webinar with Dr. Yoni Palencia. We planned this webinar to be a two-series seminar. Today we're going to have the first session, and there will be a second session on May 11th for those who are currently working on DAGs on their SALURBAL projects, so we can help to give more specific feedbacks on their DAGs. So this is an outline of the presentation. We'll give more information about the second seminar at the end of this presentation today. So this is an outline of our presentation today. I'm going to start by giving a short introduction to causal inference. Keep in mind that causal inference could be a semester course, and so this is a really, really brief introduction just to put it in the context of DAGs, which is what we want to use DAGs for. Then Yoni will take over the presentation, and she's going to talk about the essential elements of a DAG, confounders, mediators, and colliders. And she's also going to give the example of her SALURBAL paper where she's using DAGs. Then I'm going to come back and talk about the deseparation rules and how we can use those rules, and work with the examples on how to apply those. And we're going to move on to give a DAGity demonstration. DAGity is the software, interactive software that helps us to draw DAGs. You can participate in this webinar in a couple of ways. First, participants can use the chat box to ask questions. I would ask that during the presentation, maybe you keep your mics off, your audio off, and then ask questions. And then we're going to look at these questions throughout the presentation. And also there will be moments during the presentation that we're going to open up for questions if you prefer to ask the question instead of writing it down. So as I mentioned, I'm going to give a very brief introduction of causal inference. And one way to talk about it is to talk about the potential outcome framework. This framework was created by Neyman, first proposed by him in 1923. It helps us to think about ways, develop this causal thinking, right? So it helps us to think about this alternative situation in which experiments are developed. So usually when we talk about causal inference, we are talking about interventions or experiments. And so we want to ask the question whether that intervention, that outcome would have happened if the intervention didn't occur. So I'll give a practical example, it's gonna be easier. Here, when you look at the example, if you consider, and throughout this presentation, we're gonna be calling the interventions letter A. Letter A here is taking aspirin, that's the treatment of choice for this example. And we want to know whether taking aspirin improves headache or makes the headache go away, right? So in order to think about that problem and to ask whether the taking aspirin really caused that effect, then you have to think about the alternative situation in which you didn't take the aspirin, right? And ask the question, would I have gotten better anyway? So that's the way that we think about causal questions. Another term that we use for that is the term counterfactual. It's this alternative reality that we never observed, but it helps us to think about the sort of comparison group. So here is our example again. Here we have 6 people, and then we can see their potential outcomes, right? So in this case here is a situation in which they didn't take the aspirin, and the other one, that's the outcome under the treatment equals 1, we have the outcomes when they do take the aspirin, right? So of course we can't see this thing, and that's why they are called potential outcomes. But if we could see, we could calculate individual level causal effect for each of these people, right? We could also calculate the average causal effect by calculating the average treatment in the situation in which they took the aspirin minus the average treatment in the situation in which they didn't take the aspirin, right? This is called the average causal effect, and it's also known as the average treatment effect. But that obviously cannot happen, right? We can't see this alternative world in which things didn't happen, so we can test to see whether our intervention had an effect. But there is a very good application that we use, which is in randomized experiments, right? So in randomized experiments, we have here that same example, but we have 3 people who received the treatment, right? And we have here their outcomes, and we have 3 people that did not receive the treatment, and we have here the outcomes. So this is going to be the treatment, and this is going to be the control group. But the problem is that we don't see their counterfactual, right? We don't see the potential outcome when they didn't take the treatment for these 3 people here on top. And we don't see the outcome that would be the case if they had taken the treatment. But so that means we can't calculate the individual level effects for each person like we did before, like we could have done before. But we can still calculate the average causal effect because we have here the average of those who had taken an aspirin and the average of those who didn't take the aspirin, right? So we can calculate again the average causal effect. We only can do this in the context of a randomized experiment because in a randomized experiment, the treatment assignment is random, which means that the predictors of the outcome in this group are distributed similarly as the predictors of the outcome in this group, right? So these 2 groups are comparable, which means that in every way they look alike, right? So the treatment group here, it looks like the control group in every way except for the fact that the treatment group received the treatment, meaning the aspirin. This is called exchangeability, okay? The fact that they are comparable in each way. And this is the first DAG you're gonna see today. So we see here the treatment again, and this arrow means that there is they are causally related, right? There is an effect that goes from A to Y. And we have here this L that represents a set of covariates that are predictors of the outcome. What you see here is actually, it's the most interesting part, is the fact that for the random experiment, there is no relationship between the treatment assignment and these other predictors, right? And that's why, in this case, we can identify, meaning we can isolate the effect of the treatment on the outcome, right? Because in this example, A is independent of L. This is how you represent that, this upside down T. In this case, A is independent of L. However, randomized experiments are not always possible. In some cases, they're not even indicated. And we have a host of observational data that we have available. Causal inference methods have evolved to use this observational data in order to answer the questions that we are interested in. However, the problem that we have, the main drawback of observational studies is that we don't have a randomization of the treatment assignment, right? So now, see the difference between these 2 DAGs, we have now an arrow between L and A, which means that these 2 variables, they are no longer independent, meaning there is a variable here or a set of variables here that's going to influence both taking the aspirin and the outcome. However, there is a way to go around that, which is if we know which are these covariates and we can measure them, we can condition on them. Condition here means the same thing as adjusting for or stratifying by, right? This is the symbol, and we're gonna see that in other DAGs when we move forward in this presentation. If we condition on them, we can again isolate the effect or identify the effect of A on Y and measure this effect, right? So again, in observational studies, we don't have the benefit of having a randomized treatment assignment, but if we know the variables that affect the treatment, we can condition on those variables and you can reach conditional exchangeability, okay? So Yoni is going to talk more about the elements of a DAG and the difference between things that are DAGs and things that are not DAGs. But if you have any question about the previous slides, you can ask. I'm also going to look at the, I'm going to stop sharing here. I'm also going to look at the chat. I realized that when I have presentation mode, I cannot look at the chat, so I didn't see any questions, but if there are no questions, Leonie can move,
Okay. So, can you see my slides? Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, good. Okay, so Priscilla has already shown some DAGs, but now it's the moment like say, okay, but what is a DAG exactly, right? So a DAG is something that it looks like this. And mainly what the name DAG or the initials DAG mean is directed acyclic graph. So that means that a DAG, it will be always a graph that it's directed, which means that it has arrows that point one direction, and it's acyclic, which means that a DAG will never have loops. Then another, wait, I need to move your faces because I cannot see my slide. Okay, now. So then a DAG is it's considered a mathematical object built from letters and arrows, and it's a visual representation of qualitative causal assumptions. So we will talk a bit more about this. Then another good or important question is, what is a DAG useful for? Well, actually, a DAG is something that can be useful in any stage of your research. For example, when you're designing a study, drawing a DAG, taking into account all the different factors that are related to your research question, it can help you to identify some biases that your design has. Then when, for example, you have already your data and you are asking other research questions and you need to do your analysis plan, drawing a DAG, it's also very useful in order to identify which of your variables can be confounders or maybe mediators of your main association that you're looking. Then once you have your results, also having a DAG, it kind of helps you to really interpret, discuss, and understand your results, because the idea is that when you are drawing a DAG, you are taking into account variables that you have, so measured variables or maybe unmeasured variables. And sometimes maybe you get some weird results, and those can be explained by residual confounding that you can identify in your DAG. Then another way that DAGs are very useful is to communicate with other researchers, because at the end, a DAG is something that it's very visual and it's kind of intuitive to understand. So it's always easier to explain to another researcher what you're doing, just drawing instead of just using words. And then another thing that I personally think it's very useful is while you are reading scientific literature, or when you are reading a paper and you draw a DAG while you are reading, it's always very good to have this reference to really follow and understand what the authors are explaining to you. So having said that, so let's go to the most basic part of this presentation. So what are the elements of a DAG? So first, we have what are called nodes or vertices. It depends on the literature that you read. And those are mainly the variables that can be observed or unobserved. And here we have A and Y. So in this presentation, we are going to use the letter A as exposure, Y as an outcome, L as a measured variable, and U as an unmeasured variable. Then we have H, which is mainly a line, and then we have the arrow, which is the directed H. And the arrows always represent, or is the way you draw in a DAG, the possible direct causal effect between the different variables. So for example, here we have A, then an arrow that goes from A to Y. So what we are saying here is that A has a causal effect on Y. Or we don't know whether A has a causal effect on Y or not. So complete DAGs do not exclude any possible causal effect. So I know that this can sound kind of confusing, but at the end, the main idea is, for example, you know that, or we know through the literature that smoking has a causal effect on lung cancer. So smoking causes lung cancer. But then we also know that not everybody that smokes has lung cancer. So there are other factors, right? So maybe this is going to get more clear now. And here, for example, we have A and Y, but we don't have a line. So A does not have a causal effect on Y. So that means that incomplete DAGs encode expert knowledge in the form of missing arrows. So the idea of this slide is that mainly the idea is that when we don't draw an arrow between two variables, we are explicitly saying that there's no causal effect. But when we are drawing an arrow, we are saying that we know through the literature that maybe there's a causal effect between these two arrows, okay? So then another thing is the node terminology. This is very specific from DAGs. So as I said before, we have these 4 different letters. Here we have A, that it's the exposure. Then we have L, which is the measure variable. Y is the outcome. And then we have 2 U's, U1 and U2, which are unmeasured variables. So in node terminology, we have what is called the descendants. So the descendants are all nodes directly or indirectly caused by the node. So if we take A as a reference, A has 2 descendants, L and Y. Then we have the concept of children. Children are all nodes directly caused by the node. So again, taking as a reference A has 1 child, which is L. Then another concept or terminology is ancestors. Ancestors are all nodes directly or indirectly causing the node. So taking L as a reference, we can say that L has 3 ancestors, has A, U1, and U2. And then the last one is parents. So parents are all direct causes of the node. So having, again, L as a reference, L has 1 parent, which is A. Okay, so having said all these, so what is DAG? Is this a DAG? Is this a directed acyclic graph? Yes, it is. Then the next one, here we have a small change. We have changed the direction of this arrow here between A and L. So is this a DAG? Is this directed? It's a cyclic? Yes, it is. And what about the last one? We have, in this one, we have changed the direction of this arrow between A and Y. So is this a DAG? Well, in this case, we cannot say that this last one is a DAG, because in this case, this is cyclic. We are having a loop here. So using the node terminology that I already explained, for example, if we are taking A as a reference, A has one child, which is L, but at the same time, L, it's an ancestor of A. So this is the same that's saying that your child is your grandparent. So it doesn't make sense in the DAG wall. So again, those two are DAGs because they are directed in a cyclic graph. Those have 3 nodes with 3 random variables and then arrows. And then there's a concept that maybe it's not used always, but the idea that by convention, time goes from left to right. So the thing is, DAGs can be represented in different ways. You can see them represented like this in the left, but you can also see this kind of representation in the right, which is really taking into account this idea that time goes from left to right. And in this kind of representation, you can see that all the arrows go from left to right. So another essential concept in DAGs is the concept of paths. So a path is a sequence to get from one vertex, one variable, to another one, traveling through the arrows. And those paths have mainly 2 rules. They cannot pass the same vertex, the same variable twice, but they can move against the direction of the arrow. And this is what is called backdoor path. So in this case, what are the paths between A and Y? So we have this path here, which is the directed path from A to Y, but then we have another path that's going from A through L to Y. And this is a backdoor path because in this part, the first arrow is going against the direction of the arrow. So in this other example, the arrow between A and L has changed the direction. Again, we have one path here from A to Y, and then another path going from A through L to Y. And in this last example, that we have changed this other arrow between L and Y. Again, we have one path from A to Y, and then we have another path between going from A through L to Y. So having explained the paths, let's talk about what are the confounders, mediators, and colliders. So in this first example, if we delete the direct path, so we focus in the path that goes through L, we can say in this case, this is a confounder because L is a common cause between A and Y. And using the other representation that I showed before, you can represent this like this. Then this other example in which we change the direction of the arrow between A and L, deleting again the direct path, so we focus in the path that goes through L. This is a mediator because L is between A and Y. So in other representation, it would be like this in the right. Then the last example in which we have 2 arrows pointing to L. So the arrow that goes from A to L, and then another arrow that goes from Y to L. Again, we delete the directed path. This is what it's called a collider. And a collider, it's mainly a common effect for A and from A and Y. So in this other kind of representation, we can see it like this. Okay, the concept of a collider, it's a very important concept in DAGs because the idea is that we have this path, but in DAGs, when we have a collider, so again, when we have a variable that has 2 arrows pointing to it, it's considered that the path is blocked. So that's why here I'm making disappear the path, but the path is there anyway, but it's blocked. Priscilla is going to explain a bit more about this later. So do you have any question? Feel free to unmute yourself if you want to ask something. No?
Sorry, I don't know if you will give us an example of a collider in a study or an
Sure.
example that you can give us?
Yes, we are going to show more. So now I'm just giving like the extremely basic concepts, and we will go through examples. Yes. Anything else?
There is a question about whether something can be a confounder and a mediator at the same time. And that's true. A variable can be a partial mediator and a confounder too. Whether there is a way to represent it in a DAG, if something is a mediator and a confounder at the same time, I'll have to look at that.
I wanted to also ask
Yes.
whether you can explain why the collider DAG is not cyclic in the sense of why it's not like the case where we had a non-DAG before.
Because it's not a loop. So to be cyclic, you should need to have the arrow between L and Y. No, sorry. This should go that, so in the other direction, and the arrow between Y and A in the other direction in order to have like a loop, like a circle. But this is not a circle because you have two arrows pointing to L. I don't know if I'm explaining myself.
Yeah, would it become it because, and also because in L it's locked, but could we risk making it a cycle if we unlock L?
Yeah, we are going to talk about then the separation rule explanation that Priscilla will make in a few minutes. She will talk about this. What happens when you unblock? So when you adjust a collider, what happens? Okay, we will talk about this. So for now, it's just the basic concepts. Okay?
That's actually the next thing we're going to talk about.
Yeah.
I have a question, Mika.
Sure.
Interactions or moderations, how does that fit in here?
So DAGs are, they're non-parametric. So having an arrow, for example, here between L and A, just means that there is a causal relation between L and A. That relationship could be altered by a third variable, right? So the DAG doesn't assume, it assumes that that is a possibility, is the default. There is no way to indicate in a DAG which is the variable that you think influences this relationship. You know what I mean? So there is a causal effect here between L and A. There might be another variable that is changing this effect in weird ways, but we cannot represent that in a DAG because it's something that is already assumed.
Okay, thanks.
I have a question.
Sure.
It's related with the utility of using DAGs. We are more used to use it to identify colliders, mediators, and confounders to adjust in our analysis. But you mentioned it's useful to identify bias of study design. Could you give us an example or something related? Because it's not so common to see DAG applications on it, at least for me. But
yeah. Okay, maybe I will need to think a bit more to give a proper example. But the main idea is that when you are designing your study, generally you are deciding. So you have a big research question, right? and then you design a study to answer this research question. And when you are in this process, you are also deciding which variables that have an important role in this study you are going to measure. But the thing is that, but there will be always variables that you won't measure. So when if you draw a DAG and you take into account all the different variables and factors that can affect to your research question, whether you will measure them or not, you will be able to identify if you will have, for example, residual confounding, or you will have some bias because you won't take into account certain things. If you're asking me for a proper example, maybe I will need to think more about it, and I can send you something after the webinar. I'm happy with that. Yeah. Okay.
There's a question from Isabel. She's asking, in the first case, Isabel, do you mean in the first case, in the first DAG here in the slide?
Yes, in the case of confounder.
So in this case, L is a confounder, right? But if you have the arrow the opposite, then you have the DAG below that, right? Which is the creator. You can't have two arrows coming from this. You can't have them both because that would have a cyclical, right? So you have A affecting L, L affecting A again. So if you have two arrows like that, then you have a cyclic, and then it's no longer a DAG.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's actually some of the idiosyncrasy of DAGs, that it kind of forces you to decide in which direction you put the arrows. And and this has to do it forces you to make decisions in order to really decide what is the let's say the framework in which you are relying on. I hope I'm explaining myself.
Now there is a way. There is a way, Isabel, to represent that in a DAG if you have repeated measures over time. Yes. So you could have, let's say, L is a variable, and you have L1, L2, L3 measures and different points, and you think that the variable A affects L in the time 2, and then L affects A in time 3. Then you could have that type of, but you would have to represent that in your DAG, that you are measuring these variables at different times.
Okay. Now I'm thinking about my case because, for example, I can call L, how can I say that? Inequality and A segregation, but in the literature we don't, we can't say what cause what define what. So, and it's very complicated. So in my model, I use it. I call it inequality confounder, but I think it's not the case because I have established the both directions, like inequality affects segregation, segregation affects inequality. So it's cyclic, so it's not a DAG.
Okay.
That's right.
But then, so the idea is that DAGs take into account time. So that's what actually Priscilla is saying. So if you are doing different measures, you represent it as a different variable. So and also the utility is that you will need to do analysis, right? So, and when you are doing your analysis, you are defining which one is the exposure and which one is the outcome. So which one goes first and which one goes after, right? So yeah, so in your case, I mean, I'm not so sure if I understood properly, but if you are if you are making an arrow that points both directions, then I don't know how you conceptualize, like, to answer your question. If you have, like,
no, in my case, the output is on site, so it's like the Y. Sorry, I forgot of this letter. And the the principal variable, we are analyzing the effect of segregation on sites. And we are considering inequality as a confounder.
Okay.
You know what I mean?
It's Isabel who is talking, right?
Isabel, I think this would be a good example to discuss in session 2.
Yes.
Because then we can give more like a specific feedback on that DAG. It looks like you're very interested in segregation, and you want to adjust for inequality because you think that somehow affects segregation and affects your exposure, but you really have to think about whether you really need to adjust for inequality. The only situation in which you need to adjust for inequality is if you think that inequality affects both your exposure of interest and your outcome of interest. If you think it only, that's why I showed that first DAG showing that it's not just necessary for the confounder to affect the outcome, it also has to affect the exposure. So if you think that inequality only affects the outcome, you probably should not adjust for that.
Maybe because there's this solution when you have things that influence each other in time, that you give them a time 1, time 2 structure, so you can actually place them in a DAG. In Leticia's question, maybe there's an issue of scale. Like the inequality that precedes segregation is a large scale inequality, right? A country level inequality. But then the inequality that influences a homicide is maybe the local inequality or a more local phenomenon. So there maybe, if you named the variables differently,
yeah,
and you were able to measure them differently, you could put them in a DAG in different positions.
Sometimes it helps me to think about the sort of unmeasurable variables that we don't have in our data, like historical context. What was the historical context that led to these both things happen? So it's not really that one causes the other, but there is like this initial conditions that generated both things. And that's why we see them both together.
No, yes, I understand. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. And again, we will be able to discuss a lot more in detail and deeply in the session 2 for those who are going to join, and we will talk about specific examples from SALURBAL. Okay, so let's move on. So I create honestly I oversimplify one SALURBAL example just to not make it too complex now. And I used the question of, are built environment features associated with hypertension? This is actually one of my questions, but I know that other people are asking the same question with diabetes, obesity, so it's more or less the same idea. And I put exposure built environment, which again, it's an oversimplification because we have many variables of built environment in SALURBAL, but just to simplify. Outcome, hypertension, and then covariates, age, sex, education, physical activity as an unmeasured variable, and air pollution. And again, we could put way more covariates here, but let's start with something more simple. So this is the DAG that I draw. So for example, here we have built environment. Built environment here is an exposure that has a causal effect on hypertension. Then on the top, we have air pollution that has an arrow that goes from built environment to air pollution, and then air pollution, an arrow that goes to hypertension. So in this case, in this DAG, air pollution would be a mediator of built environment and hypertension. Then going below and to the left, we have age, sex, and education, that the three of them have an arrow that goes to built environment, another arrow that goes to physical activity, and another arrow that goes to hypertension. So these three variables are common cause of built environment and hypertension. So these three variables would be confounders. And then going to the right here, physical activity, Physical activity has arrows coming from age, sex, and education, and then an arrow that comes from built environment, and then an arrow that goes from physical activity to hypertension. So in this case, physical activity is a mediator of built environment and hypertension, and at the same time, it's a collider, right? Because it's receiving a lot of arrows. So something that somebody could say like, okay, but built environment and hypertension have also a lot of arrows that are put to them. Okay, but built environment and hypertension, in this case, are our exposure and our outcome. So in this case, in this specific question, we won't consider them as colliders. But for example, if our research question is another one, and we are like, for example, looking at an association between education and physical activity, and we draw a similar DAG to this one, then for this question, built environment and hypertension would be a colliders of this specific question. Okay? So, and another thing that sometimes can be useful when you are drawing a DAG is that, for example, these three variables here, age, sex, and education, that have all of them the same three arrows, you can put them all together in order just to simplify your DAG and to make it more visual or easier for you to work with it. Okay? So here, just a summary of I just said, confounders, mediators, colliders, and also a note about built environment and hypertension. And I don't know if you have any question about this example. I can see.
I'm a bit confused. Oh, sorry. If you can show the first diagram. What I'm confused is about the collider, because I have understood that like physical activity needs to have like two ends of the arrows, like from both sides, so that it is a collider. But in that case, yeah, I see that there are many arrows going to physical activity that we had, you know, pointing to physical activity, but on the other side from hypertension, I don't see an arrow getting to physical activity. So it's just a confusion. So why it is a collider? If you can explain that again, please. Sorry.
Okay, maybe this is something that will be more understood after explaining the separation rules. I don't know what you think, Priscilla. You're on mute. Okay. Okay. Well, so.
Can you repeat the question, Yoni? Sorry.
No, I was just thinking. So at the end, the idea is a collider that has different arrows that it's pointing to it. This is the main idea of a collider. But yeah, in this specific example, I just think that maybe the question that Marianela is making maybe will be more understood after explaining the separation rules. Yeah, the short answer, Marianela, is that a collider is path specific. So a variable could be a collider in the path and not be a collider in a different path. Yeah. So to define a collider, you have to know where the variable is in relation to other variables, because that same variable might not be a collider in a different path. We are going to see an example when I talk about the rules. Yeah. Yeah, so the main idea just is that a collider is a variable that receives it has different arrows pointing to it. And as, yeah, and Priscilla said, it depends which path you are analyzing. But I just think that this is going to be maybe more understood when Priscilla explains the separation rules. Yeah, so just wait a bit. There is one question, Yoni, on the chat about how do you think that sex and education have a causal effect on built environment? That's a very good question. Yeah, I think, yeah, that's a very good question in terms that it depends how you are understanding also built environment. for example, if you are thinking about the use of built environment, it can be understood that the use differs, it depends on your gender, for example, and also education, what can be said sometimes, it depends on your level of education. You also, maybe you are more able to decide where you live. So, because education, it's generally a proxy of socioeconomic status. So depending on your socioeconomic status, maybe you will be more able to decide to live in certain neighborhoods that have certain built environment. I don't know if I answered your question with that.
Sorry, Yoni, my connection got lost in, just when you were started to
okay,
answer.
So again,
sorry.
Yeah, so you were asking about sex and education. So, for example, I will start with education again. So education generally is a proxy of social economic status. And the idea sometimes is that depending on your social economic status, maybe you will be more able to decide in which neighborhood you live. So, and yeah, so its neighborhood can have certain built environment characteristics. And a kind of similar rationale, you could put it in sex, but with sex or gender. But what I generally think more about gender, it's more about the use of built environment. So for example, in terms of using the streets or things like that. So if you are a man or a woman, maybe you will have a different kind of relationship with your built environment. I don't know if I'm answering your question.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. But of course, this is a very good point, and it could be a long discussion about that, I think.
Okay.
Although, sorry, Ion, when you put a variable in the DAG, you should have the literature supporting the hypothesis, right? So if there are not papers published that show the relationship between education and built environment, then I shouldn't just put it, or I still can put it if I have the strong idea that in a certain context that might happen, particularly the context I am conducting the study.
So your question is what you do if you don't know
you put it in the model or you don't
about it, right?
If it is required to have the literature in order to put the variable in the model, or if you have this strong idea that the variable is related to, it is related, in this case, for example, education, it is related to built environment, but I don't have the literature supporting that. And I still put it in the model?
Well, I mean, the idea is that you should base your knowledge in the literature. So this is the main procedure that you should have. But in case that related to a certain thing you really don't know or you really don't have literature about, I guess you can just hypothesize and say that that's your hypothesis. But the main idea is to base everything you draw in a DAG in the evidence.
Okay, yes, just thinking on underserved populations where we don't necessarily have information or much literature supporting our ideas.
Yeah.
Just one comment about that. For an arrow to exist between two variables, right, indicating a causal relation, you don't need to prove that that is an association or a causal relation that is widespread and that exists in every population. Just some actually is the opposite. So the burden of proof is to show it's on saying that there is not an association, right? So if in most of the cases, all of the things are associated. So if there is evidence of the general population for one particular population, you don't need to prove or to have evidence that that association exists on the specific population you study. You can assume that that's also the case and put that in your DAG.
Thank you so much.
Okay. I think we should move on. So I think Priscilla, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. Yes. And I don't know if there is. Sorry, I can see another question. Sorry, I think maybe we missed it. From Tanya, and for hypertension, if I think hypertension could increase physical activity as part of the treatment, it should be on the DAG. It depends. Yeah, again, it depends of your research question. Personally, I think that for the research question that I presented, I would always consider more a physical activity or lack of physical activity a cause of hypertension. But if you are asking a question more related to a treatment, then I think it's a different kind of question. And maybe in this case, if you are looking for a treatment for hypertension and part of your treatment is increased physical activity, maybe you can reconsider where you put physical activity, but then it's another research question.
Okay, we can move on to the deseparation rules. First, before we go into that, let's first give an overview of paths and what are causal paths versus non-causal paths and what blocking means. Right, so first let's go back to that example that we looked at before, is the example of a classic confounder. This is another way that we can represent that. And so if we can think of this as a path, right, that is an open path, okay, because there is nothing blocking it, there is no, I'm not adjusting for L, and it can also be classified as a non-causal path. And that is the case because every time when we think about paths, right, and in this case of all of these examples, we are thinking about always the path that goes from A to Y, right? So every time we talk about paths and we talk about confounders and colliders, we have to think about what is the path that we're starting from. And this is the path that we're starting from for all these examples, right? So A is our exposure and Y is our outcome. So this is the path between A and Y. And this is a non-causal path because in order to go from A to Y, I have to move against the arrow, right? So I have to move from here to here, I have to move against the arrow. So this is a non-causal path. This is the kind of path I want to block, okay? This is the second type of path that we saw. And this, again, is an open path because I'm not adjusting for anything, but it's a causal path, right? And why is that a causal path? Because I'm moving along with the arrows, right? It's a causal path and it's also known as a mediator, right? So L here is a mediator on this path. The third path that we're gonna see is the collider, right? In each case, in this case here, L is the collider variable on this path from A to Y. And again, this path is blocked because the L is a collider. So on this path here, it's already closed. I don't need to adjust for anything. It's already adjusted for, okay? Okay, so these separation rules, they basically put all of that information together on three simple, relatively simple rules. These rules are put together by Pearl in 1995. They're actually pretty complex the way that he had to prove it. There's a lot of work done in order to prove that those rules, they actually correctly encode the relationships between the variables in a DAG. But we're not going to go through how he proved it. There is an article in the end of the presentation in the literature review if you want to check how he did that. But we're just going to go really very practically through the rules. I think there is a radio in the background, somebody? No? If you can turn off the, sorry. So the first rule is this one, that it says, if there are no variables being conditioned on, and I'm sorry, I have to change my, if there are no variables being conditioned on, a path is blocked if and only if two arrowheads in a path collide at some point on the path, right? So basically, this is a classic example of a collider. So this is not being conditioned on, but this path is already blocked because I have these two arrows converging now. Okay, this is the first rule. So I don't need to do anything about this path. This path is already closed. The second rule is a path is blocked if it contains a non-collider that has been conditioned on. Right, so that classic collider example, that classic confounder example that we have, in order to block that path, I just have to adjust for L, or condition on L, okay? The third rule is a collider that has been conditioned on does not block a path. So it's similar to this first one. If I adjust for L here, because L is a collider, then I'm opening this path. This is something I don't want to do. And this 3.1 rule is just really to remind that if you condition on a descendant of a collider, you also block that path, right? So not just the collider, but even the descendant of a collider, you also open that path, okay? This is an example of a collider that it's an example that we see a lot, people see a lot when they work with hospitalization data, because hospitalization is a common cause of many conditions, right? So this is something that people are going to be hospitalized for different things. And in the overall population, we might not see an association, right, between road injury, for example, and childbirth. But because people get hospitalized for these two conditions, if you just look at the hospitalization data, you are, in other words, conditioned on a common cause, right? Which is, in this case, is hospitalization. So this is what you have in the overall population. It's fine because hospitalization is a collider. We're not adjusting for it. We're not doing anything. You're not going to probably find association between childbirth and road injury. But if you look at just hospitalization data, because you were conditioning on a collider where you're stratifying just people who were hospitalized, and if you look at the cause of hospitalization, you're going to see people that either were hospitalized for road injuries or were hospitalized to deliver a baby, excluding those rare cases that somebody might have been going to the hospital and got into a traffic accident. Let's not think about those cases, but if you look at the hospitalization data, you're going to see a strong and negative association between road injury and childbirth. And you could conclude that being pregnant or giving birth to a child protects you from road injuries. Okay, so that's a typical example of a collider. Do you have questions about the rules or the example of a collider? And then we'll go over some examples of how to apply the rules.
Could you just explain again how being pregnant would be a positive effect on road injury?
It wouldn't be a positive effect, right? I'm just assuming that in the overall population, there is no association between road injury and childbirth. But if I just look at hospitalization data, because people get hospitalized for different reasons, right? So if I look at the records and I say, oh, 50% of the people, just a number, were hospitalized because of a road injury, right? And among those, nobody, probably a very small percentage of those will have other causes of hospitalization that are related to childbirth, right? Just because the people who were hospitalized for childbirth, they were not involved in a road injury. So I found an association between these two things, a negative association, right? Because every time I know somebody was hospitalized for a road injury, they obviously were not hospitalized also for the delivery of a child. So you are hospitalized by either one or the other. So that's the kind of negative association that you see when you condition on a collider.
I might have missed this, but a collider is basically an intervening variable that leads to an artifact finding. Why would we want to block paths in general?
So we don't want to block a path, but sometimes we do it by mistake, right? In this case, for example, when you look at hospitalization data, you don't know you are adjusting for a collider, but that's what you're doing because you are stratifying, you're just looking at people who are hospitalized. You're going to find spurious associations between things that don't exist in the overall in the general population. That's, I mean, you usually don't want to, you definitely don't want to condition on a collider, but sometimes you might do depending on the data that you have. And that's a classic case of collider conditioning on a collider.
And then what exactly does it mean to block a path? If you could, I don't know if you explained it earlier, but when do we do it? What does it mean?
So in this case, if a collider is on a path, right? So if you go to the first rule, if there is a collider on that path between A and Y, this path is already blocked. It means that the association between those two variables is not transmitted. Okay, so I can just look at the association between A and Y in this example, and I don't need to worry about adjusting for L. Right? In the second example, because L is not a collider, L is a confounder, then I have to adjust for it in order to close that path because that path is open. Right? And in the third one is the collider example, but adjusted for. In that case, I open the path. This is the case that I showed after, that's the hospital. This is this case here, right? So I'm adjusting for hospitalization, which is a collider, and then I will start finding spurious associations between things that are normally not related. Any questions?
And this is Goro. Can I ask a question?
Sure, Goro. Hi.
This seminar, because I do not understand collider yet. So what is a data setting? Well, you showed us this example of hospitalization, childbirth, and road injury.
Mm-hmm.
And so what is a data setting here? Are we handling individual records, or are we handling aggregated data set which contains a proportion of childbirth and proportion of road injury, etc. So I was not sure what is a data setting, or my question is what is a unit of analysis in the example you gave us?
Oh, the unit of analysis would just be the medical records, the main cause of hospitalization, right? So the main cause of hospitalization would be either, I don't know what causes of, maybe I should have prepared better for this example. What are the causes of hospitalizations there will be in terms of ICD codes, right? So you just have one ICD code and maybe you have another contributory causes for the hospitalization. And so you're going to have in your record either the causes that are associated with road injuries or delivery of a child, right? You're not likely to find people who with both causes in the same record, right? So you can just see either one or the other. So this is like a perfect correlation in the sense that every time you have a road injury, you didn't have a baby.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how this data, that's how these two variables are going to be spuriously associated.
Okay.
Even though in the general population, that's not the case.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. I'll think about it again. Yep.
Okay. So, sorry.
Just Goro, I mean, in these cases, mainly DAGs are more used to organize your concepts. Sometimes it's not like about that many details, it's just to organize the concepts. In this case, it's just the idea that giving birth, it doesn't create a road injury, you know? It's more about the concepts than the details, actually.
Maybe I struggled in understanding the example because in this case, we want to show well, so our study hypothesis is if the birth is going to be associated with road
in this
injury.
case, sorry, in this case, birth will be a protective effect, right? So I will see a protective effect of being pregnant or delivering a baby again for road injuries, because I would see either one or the other. Or I would say that being involved with a road injuries protects you from being pregnant, because I will have an inverse association between those two things.
So maybe I think I fail to understand the setting because I should say, well, like these are two separate events, right? And birth and injury, and what kind of association are we looking at here?
Maybe we need to understand the research question to understand what you're showing us with hospitalizations. I'm kind of confused too of what analysis what you want to be doing that will show this. It's interesting to know that through
this example doesn't. Sorry.
It's interesting in that example to see that through sample selection you can open a collider path, but I don't really see what's going on with the examples. Maybe the research question is helpful.
Yeah, so this example doesn't come from a research question. It's just to show like two absurd sort of outcomes that could be associated just because you are adjusting for a collider. So you can think about any outcomes that would lead to hospitalization, and if you select on hospitalization, right, that's the basis of selection bias. So if you select on hospitalizations, you're going to find all sorts of associations with hospitalization data, because hospitalization is a common outcome of many things. Is that still confusing? So you can substitute road injury and childbirth for a range of other conditions. And if you just look at hospitalization data, because people are hospitalized by one thing and not the other, very rarely, there are two things combined, then you're going to see sort of associations between things that normally don't exist. I'm going to show some examples. Actually, in the original presentation in the original class that we taught at the UHC, we didn't have an example for a collider. We just showed the letters. And some people ask for a real example, and it's hard to find in the literature because that's not something that people are interested on, right? You are interested in not controlling for a collider. So you only find that in the literature that looks at studies that failed and found associations that didn't really exist. But I think that showing examples with letters just really like takes away all of this background. Oh, why are those things, like thinking about just the letters and looking at it with a more sort of step-by-step way without thinking much about the background helps to understand better the rules of the deseparation. So I can show some examples and we can go back to that question if it's still not clear. What do you think? Okay, so we are going to let's go through some examples of how to think of this, how those deseparation rules can be applied to DAGs in general, okay? So for that, this first example shows a collider, and you see there, we're usually going to represent a collider with a Z. So when we see a figure like that, we can think about how many paths are there, right? And we have basically two paths, right? So we have one path that we are interested on is the path that goes from A to Y, and that's the causal path. And we have this other path here that goes from A to B to Z to C to Y. It can also be represented this way. And we can see here, right there, that the Z is a collider, right? Because there are two arrows marking to Z. So usually, when we think about this separation, what we are trying to do is close all the non-causal paths that are open. Basically, that's the summary that we want to do when we apply the separation rules. So we look for paths, and the causal paths I want to keep open. The non-causal paths I want to close. And the non-causal paths that are already closed, I don't want to do anything with them, right? So we have one causal path here that we want to keep, and we want one non-causal path that is already closed. So this DAG is perfect. We don't need to do anything. So that's how we get to our set of variables that is sufficient to identify the effect of A on Y, right? So in this case, the set of variables is empty. I don't need to adjust for anything because the only other path that I have is already closed by a collider, okay? Sometimes B can be an important variable that I want to stratify by, like sex, right, or age. And so I might want to adjust for B even though I don't need to. So I can adjust for B. Nothing, it doesn't do anything bad to my DAG or to my analysis, right? Because B is not a collider, so it's fine. If I also want to adjust for C for other reasons, it's fine. So I can adjust for B, I can adjust for C, and I can also adjust for B and C if I want. It's fine. I will still have my identified effect of A on Y. Okay, but I cannot control for Z. If I control for Z, I open this path, which means that I have to adjust by either B or C. Any questions about this one?
Quick question. Can you control for B, C, and Z?
Yes.
And that will be fine. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Is there a difference between controlling or adjusting, or is the same thing?
No, it's all the same thing.
Okay.
Controlling for, adjusting for, stratifying by, condition on is all the same thing.
Hi, this is Xavi. Just a question. So why would you adjust for either B or C if they are not having a simultaneous effect on both the exposure and the outcome?
So you don't need to, right? So that's why you have the empty set here. You don't need to adjust for anything. That's your minimum set of sufficient variables that you need. But you might want to adjust because, for example, it's age and you want to look at the effect stratified by age. So you might want to adjust for B or C, depending on what they are, but you don't need to.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, I have a question. So when you talk about the effects stratified by age, do you include like an interaction term between the treatment and age, or you just put age as like an additive effect?
Yes, so if B is age and you want to look at interaction, there is no, you don't need to do anything to this DAG. That's already represented, that's already saying that the effect of B on A, it's not homogeneous, right? It's a non-parametric association. It's a non-parametric model. So I'm not assuming anything about the relationship between B and A. I'm just saying they are causally related. Does that answer your question? So in this, yeah.
Yeah, I think my question is, so here if we assume like the effect of A is heterogeneous and depending on B, so in order to model that heterogeneous effect, do we include an interaction term between A and B? Or,
that's right.
Okay.
Yeah, so in your model, you're going to have the interaction term, but there is no way to represent that in the DAG.
Okay, I see.
Yeah. And that's the same thing as this one. It's just to remind you that if Z has a descendant and you adjust for that descendant, you also open in that path. So you need to additionally adjust on B or C, by B, C, or both in order to close that path again. Okay, so that's the same thing as this, but it's just you adjusting on the descendant of collider. Okay, so here we have a slightly more complicated DAG. And again, we are always going from A to Y, right? So here, just thinking about the paths that we have one path that goes from A to Y. That's our causal path. We have one path that goes from A to B to Z to C to Y. And we have another path that goes from A to Z to C to Y. Is this a path? Do you think this is a path? Y, A, C, Z, A? Not for this particular example that we're talking about, because we want to know, right, the effect of A on Y. So a path never can path. I was trying to make the case that a path cannot go to a variable over a variable twice, right? So you have this path A, B, Z, C, Y. You have this path A, Z, C, Y, but you don't have a path that goes like A, B, Z, A, B, Z, A, Z, C, Y, because it can never go twice over the same variable. So here is just this showing the paths, right? So we have a causal path, that's A to Y, and we have these two other paths, the red one, which is A, Z, C, Y, this one, and A, B, Z, C, Y, that's this one. So now, thinking about identify the effect on A on Y, what do I need to do here, right? So we can look at this and this, and see, and here we go back to what Marinella asked before. So you can see here that Z here is not a collider on this path, but it's a collider on this path, right? And so since I have them both in the same DAG, I have to adjust for something else that is not Z. Because if I adjust for Z, I open this path, right? If in my attempt to close this path, I adjust for Z, then I open this path. So this is a way that organize the paths that we can see what variables could be colliders, so that, and make sure that we don't adjust for them, right? So what is the set of variables that is sufficient to identify the effect of A on Y here? I can just adjust for C. By adjusting for C, I close this path, and this path is already closed because Z is a collider. Right, so that's the minimum set of variables that I need to adjust for. I just need to adjust for C, sorry. If I need to adjust for Z for some other reason, because let's say Z is age or sex, and I need to adjust for that in my model, then you have to adjust for something else, right? This something else is either B or C, and that's what you have here. If you do adjust for Z, you have to adjust for B or C or both. Do you have any questions about this? I'll show you a real example now from a paper. And let me just show you here. This is the last example, and then we're gonna move on to the DAGity. This is a paper looking at the effect of smoking on end-stage renal disease. So this is our exposure, this is our outcome. We have these are covariates. These are things that they adjusted for, and this box around those variables means that they were adjusted for. Okay, so they also adjusted for prior disease. We are also allowed to put unobserved variables in our DAGs, right? So like we can see here, the smoking status previous to this study was unknown, but they put it in the DAG anyway. And we're gonna see that we don't really need to adjust for that because we're already adjusting for other things that are in that path. So basically we are closing that path even though we don't know, we don't have a measure for that. These green arrows are the causal effects, the causal paths, right? So the things that we don't want to close. And the black ones are the causal paths that are already closed because I adjusted for these things, okay? So what they want to do in this study was to look at the adjustment, to look at the effect, what it would happen if they adjusted by the mediators, right? So this is what they have. So again, this box around means that they adjusted here for BMI, current drinker, blood pressure, which are things that are on the pathway between smoking and end-stage renal disease, right? They also adjusted by renal status, and they adjusted by this measure that means albumin-creatinine ratio. And it's also on the path here between smoking and end-stage renal disease. However, when they adjusted for these things, they created these bias impacts, and you're going to see in diety, you're also going to see bias impacts with a different color, a pink color. They put it here. Here it's red. It just means that it's a bias impact, or it's a non-causal path that is open because they adjusted by this variable, which, if you can see here, it's a collider. Okay, so in this case, this is like our Z variable, right? This is at the same time a mediator in this path, and it's a collider on this path. So because we adjusted for it, now we have a bias model, and so we no longer can identify the effect of smoking on end-stage renal disease. So this is actually, the previous model is the correct one. You're not supposed to adjust for ACR. This is also a way that you can look at slightly different models if you are unsure. In this case, they were unsure about the causal mechanism. In one way, they thought the ACR would be just a mediator. And in this case, they thought the ACR would be a mediator, but at the same time, a common cause, it would be a cause here from this, of this unknown variable, unmeasured variable, right? So they have an unmeasured variable that causes at the same time the outcome in stage renal disease and ACR, but they didn't measure, so they can't adjust for it. And so they were testing this additional variable here and what that would do if that was a slightly different causal pathway. Do you have any questions about this example?
Yes, I have a question. So this unmeasured variable that is in the second DAG, it appears, or how we can know, or we don't know? Because my main concern is many times we adjust and we don't know there is an unmeasured covariate that could cause this mediator and also the outcome.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm right. Okay.
I mean, yes. In this case, they had a very strong case for that potential unmeasured variable there, right? So they had really a question about the causal mechanism of this outcome, and that's them hypothesizing, what if it's this way? What if this guy is actually just a mediator? And then in the other case, they were saying, oh, what if it's not a mediator? What if this is actually a common cause of this other thing, right? So you really had to know about the topic to sort of come up with this alternative pathways and to test them.
Okay.
So,
I think we have an example of this situation for the next meeting.
Okay, good. Because that's really the hardest part of drawing a DAG, right? Is figuring out what is important in the DAG and what is associated at the same time to your treatment or your exposure and your outcome, because these are really the things you want to focus on. And what are the things that are sort of on the pathway that you don't want to adjust for, right? So it's not something that you're gonna do overnight, right? You have to know about the literature, you have to get started. And I think the point of this seminar, the next seminar, is getting started with your DAG and try to think more formally about the associations you're testing, about the causal relations you're testing. And then just read more and talk to people and talk to expert knowledge in the people that are expert in the area. And then improve your DAG and ask those kind of questions that are going to, like this auto ask, right? Like, is this really in the pathway, or is this a third variable that is influencing both at the same time? And that is the kind of thinking process sort of advances the field. You're not just looking at associations, but you're really thinking very hard about the causal relations between these two things. I think that was it. And then the plan was now to move on to show DAGity. Let me just sharing. And check one more time if you have any more questions.
Opa. Wait, sorry. Okay.
Yeah, I have a question before we go into the DAGity example.
Sure.
So, would you include like data exploration in the process of thinking about your DAG, or is it like better practice if you start to think about your DAG conceptually and based on literature, and then you go on to the next phase? Because sometimes I think
Yes.
that I might be biased,
Yes.
but what I find in my data, to go back to the DAG and just try to think it over. What do you think about that?
Yeah, that's a very good point. And actually, that's the main point of drawing a DAG. So the idea is that you base your DAG in the knowledge, and then you define your analysis plan based on that. Because as you already said, you can be completely biased by your data. So the idea is that your DAG shouldn't be lead by your data. It should be lead by the knowledge and the evidence in the literature. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so you can see my screen, right? Okay, so this is the DAGity link. So what we are going to do now, it's a demonstration of what is DAGity and how DAGity works. And the idea is that, so if you have, for example, two screens and you can in one work with DAGity and the other one watch what I'm doing, then great, so you can follow me. If you don't and you only have one screen, but you think that you can follow just listening my voice, then you can try. But if not, just watch what I'm going to do and what I'm going to explain, get familiar with the interface, and then you can watch the video again. And also in the material that we already sent you, you have a short DAGity guide that Priscilla and I did. So I will mainly go through this guide that we create in order to you understand what DAGity is and how DAGity works. Okay, having said that, this is the DAGity website. And in this website, you can find these main 4 options. You have launch, that it gives you the option to use DAGity online. You also have this download option that it gives you the option to download DAGity and use it in your computer without internet. you have this learn option that if you click here, it appears another website in where you can find many different information, a very introductory information about DAGs and DAGIT. So you can find also some tutorials about how to use DAGIT. And at the end, you can find this list of introduction literature on DAGs. Okay, so going back to it. Okay, and here you also have this R code package. So actually neither Priscilla and I, we ever use this, but just for those who are R lovers, just be aware that this exists and you can try it. So going to the DAGIT, here, DAGIT is a very easy interface that you can use. Like just clicking, you can move all the different variables and that. And you have different options. Here on the top, you have this model option that it mainly gives you the option of new model. If you click here, it gets clean. So you can start from the beginning. And then another very useful thing is that you have these export options that you can use when you are done with your DAG. You can export your DAG as an image format and use it in your documents. Then you have here examples. So here you can find different examples from the literature. So I'm going to leave, for example, this one. Then you have this how-to. This is a very useful option where it explains you how to do things. So this is where you go when you forget about how to do things or you just learn how to do things from the first time. So for example, if you click add a variable, so it tells you to add a new variable, click tap on the canvas. Or how to delete a variable. So to delete a variable, click tab and then click tab delete in the variable tab or move the mouse over it. So it just explains you how to do things. Then you have this, this help. Here you can find the manual. So if you click here, it shows you actually the detailed manual of DAGIT. So you can check in case you are curious about more detailed information about how DAGIT works. And then you also have here other resources which leads you again to the learn option that I already showed you before. So going back to DAGIT, I'm going to show you the options on the left and I'm going to start from the bottom. So a key one is the legend. The legend shows you how the different variables are represented. So here you can see that the exposure is represented in this green-yellow color with this black outline and this kind of play icon. So here in this example, the exposure is warm-up exercises. Then the outcome is this, it's represented in this blue color with this eye in the center. So in the example, the outcome is injury. Then we can also find like ancestors of the exposure represented in green, yellow without any outcome. So in this case, the ancestors of the exposure would be team motivation, pre-game proprioception. And then the ancestors of the outcome are represented in blue. So here we can find these ancestors like intra-game proprioception, contact sport, neuromuscular fatigue, and more. And then we also find these red representations that mean ancestor of exposure and outcome. So actually the confounders. And in this case, we have coach, fitness level, and genetics. Then we also have the way we represent adjusted variables is in white with black outline. And then unobserved variables are represented in this light gray, and other variables in this dark gray. And then also we have different colors for the path. So actually these colors, you already saw them in the example from the paper that Priscilla has shown. So the idea is that the causal path is represented in green. Oops. And the biasing path are represented in red. Okay, so going up in these left options, we have this coloring. So with this option, you can just take the colors of the path, but we recommend not to do that because the idea is to have the different colors and to be able to identify the different paths. So we recommend you to keep it as it is. Then we have two different diagram styles. We mainly use the classic one. And going up, also here there's a view mode. We recommend you to keep it in normal. And then here variable, it gives you the option, it allows you to assign variables as exposure, outcome, adjusted, or unobserved, and we will see like. So for example, if I click here, I can do adjusted and adjusted, okay? So going to the right side, here we have this option of causal effect identification. And here in the arrow, we can see adjustment, total effect, direct effect, or instrumental variable. So in this case, we normally be using the...
Yoni, I'm sorry to interrupt.
Tell me.
I was just thinking because we don't have a lot of time until the end.
Okay.
And so I was thinking maybe if they saw an example of a DAG that we already talked about, if I could show that MDAG to them.
Okay.
It would probably be easier for them to understand that part, which is like has a lot of words in it. So it's probably hard to see. So if they look at an example that they already seen before, it's probably easier. And just because the time, it's like we are ahead of them.
Okay, so let's skip the way to do the easy example. Let's skip this part. So you're suggesting just go through the complex example, just skip the simple example?
Yeah, no, I was thinking I could show them a DAG that they already seen in the DAGity, because that will make it easier for them to relate to it, because we don't have a lot of time.
Okay, so just go directly to this. Is that what you're suggesting? Just stop here and go and show the DAG? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, okay. So should I stop sharing the screen?
Do you want me to show the DAG that I presented? Or do you want to show the simple DAG with just the confounder and how to create the variables?
Yeah, well, that was I was asking you. So I can stop sharing and you can show the example from the paper. And so you guys, you can just follow the DAGity guide that we send you, because yeah, it's just mainly the steps that I was following, and I was going to show you how to create a very simple DAG, but we can skip this part now because we don't have more time, and just go and show the example that Priscilla has shown from the paper. Let's do it like this. And also the people that are going to attend session 2, you will have time to practice DAGity, creating your own DAG. And if you have any question about how to do it, just reach us and send us an email, okay? Okay.
Okay, so can you see the screen with the right and the left part of the DAGity, or is it messed up?
Oh, it's okay.
Okay. So I just wanted to explain this part here on the right side, which is easier to explain with letters. because the other example had a lot of things, so it's probably easier to explain it like that. So in order to talk about this, I'm going to go to this example here, which is similar to the example that we showed. I'm just going to remove 2 of this so that we have that perfect M again. And here I'm just going to show change the name of the variables a little bit so we can have the same thing. And as Yoni was explaining, the how-to is really helpful here, because I can, for example, I want to rename this variable. Instead of being B, I want it to be C. So I can go here and see how to rename a variable. So it just tells me that I tap and click rename, or I just like this option that moving the mouse over and then pressing R. So I move the mouse over, press R, and then I am able to rename. I'm going to rename it as C, so we can have it exactly the same way as we had the example. I'm going to rename this too for pass over it and then press R, and then I'm going to call it Y. And then I'm going to do the same here, and then I'm going to call it B. And then for this one, I'm also going to change it to A. So now we have the exact same letters that we have in the example. Again, you can always check here. There's all of these options, how to add a connection, right? So you just, I'm going to show one example that we had a connection. It looks like it got stuck now. Okay. So here I just wanted to show, so that's our DAG, right? One of the first DAGs that we saw in the example. And then we have here our main causal path. And you see that's green, right? Which means that it's an open path and it's a causal path. And we have this other path here, which we have a collider. And since we have a collider, that says that this path is closed, right? I don't need to do anything about it. However, if by mistake, let's see what happens if I adjust for it. So how do I do here in DAGD to adjust for it? I can go and check how to adjust for a variable. Adjust for variable, right? I can just move the mouse over it and press the key A to adjust. Just like I did with rename, instead of R, I'm going to press A. Now Z is adjusted for. Okay, I could also have gone here and clicked adjust. See, now it's not adjusted, now it's adjusted. Okay, so now you see, because I adjusted for Z, now this path is open and it shows here as a biasing path, right, with this color. Now, what this right side here shows me is that the causal are those variables that we need to adjust for in order to identify the effect on A or Y, right? Because remember all that work that we did through going through each path to see if it's a collider, to see if it's a confounder. We don't need to do any of that. If we draw the DAG and we draw it correctly, DAGD is going to tell us what are the variables that we are going to adjust for. For this one doesn't sound very helpful because it's a simple DAG, but when you have a very complicated DAG, instead of going through each path, you just draw the DAG and DAGD is going to tell you what to adjust for, right? In this case, because you were already adjusting for Z, which is a collider, then it's telling you you have to adjust for B or for C, right? So what happens if I put this as not adjusted anymore, right? So now it's adjusted. I want to change it so it's no longer adjusted. What does it say here? Did it show? It says no adjustment is necessary to estimate the effect because this path is already closed. Okay. These here are the testable implications. Remember this symbol of independence? It just tells us about the other things, the other sort of causal effects that could exist in this path that I'm assuming are not there, right? So for example, we have here, so let's see this first one. It says that Z is independent of Y, right? So Z is independent of Y, condition on A and C. right? Which means that there are no other paths. There are just this path and this path. If I condition on A or C, I have no direct effect. So Z and Y are independent. This just tells us about all of the other things that are not in the DAG, right? For example, it says here that C is independent of A, right? Because there is no connection between C and A. Why there is no connection? Because Z is a collider, right? But what happens if I create an arrow, right? If I look at the literature and there is this new study that found that there might be a direct effect of A on C, and so what do I do to add that here in my DAG? In my DAG, I can look how to add a connection, right? So it's just gonna tell you tap one variable and then tap the other variable. And I can go here and tap on A, tap on C, and then here is my path. And I can show this, I can change this way and this way. Now, did you notice that this thing changed here on the right side? So now it no longer tells me that A is independent of C, because now A is no longer independent of C. Okay, so that's how you look, that's how you read this thing here. This is the model code. Did you explain this, Yoni, the model code? No, right?
No.
Do you want to go back to it? I think that's
no, I think let's keep going because we only have a few minutes. So let's keep going.
Okay. So I think that is actually it. There is one more example. That is the example of the there is the example of the paper that I have a DAG here. So what happens is that when you draw a DAG, right? When you draw a DAG, it creates a code here. So every line and every node that I added here, it creates a code. So you can copy and paste this code, and you copy this and paste in a Word document and keep it for later, and you can come again and then change your DAG the way you want. So what I did, I have this code saved before for another DAG, and what I'm gonna do here is I'm gonna paste it on this, okay? So I pasted, this is my DAG, and I click here, update DAG, and it's gonna show me that is the DAG, a simplified version of their example, looking at smoking and end-stage renal disease, right? So I have here some of the mediators that I had, BMI, blood pressure, I have the albumin creatinine ratio, and then I have this variable here that's, so all of those variables about education, age, I just put them all here in SES Simplify. And so it shows here that even though I have this unmeasured variable, it doesn't change the fact, right? It doesn't change the fact that I can identify the effect of smoking on end-stage renal disease. And it tells me here, right, when I look, what do I need to adjust for? What's the minimal set of confounders that I need to adjust for? It says you just need to adjust for SES. So what happens if I go here and adjust for SES? I'm gonna click on adjusted. Now it says this is the minimum set. I closed all my biasing paths. Now it's showing me here what are the causal paths, and it's showing that I closed all of the biasing paths. So this DAG would be able to identify the effect of the exposure on the outcome.
Can I ask you a question, Priscilla, there? So does it mean that you don't need to use, like, in your model as covariate BMI, blood pressure, I think it is the other one, or ACR? You don't need to put them at all?
Exactly, because they are mediators.
Mm-hmm.
So if what you want to know is the effect of a smoking on end-stage renal disease, you should not adjust for those. So yeah, unfortunately, we are running out of time. We had a small problem in the beginning. We sort of lost a little bit of time there. you can still send us questions. If you still have questions about the collider issue, I'm going to write I can write an email with some additional information about that. If you still have questions about the collider example, and I will look for a better example of a collider. That's always a problem because it's hard to understand. What else? We are going to send another email for those who participate in session 2 to know exactly what you're going to need to do in order to participate in session 2. Do you have anything else to say, Yoni, before we go?
No, just say that if you have any struggle with DAGIT, just feel free to send us an email. I mean, as I said, we already sent you a very small guide that you can follow, and that's it. And again, in DAGIT, you also have some tutorials and extra information that you can check too. And I think that's it. I mean, for those who just joined this first session, we hope that you learned something about DAGs. And for those who are going to join us in the session 2, we think that this one is going to be very useful, because actually some of the discussions that started here are discussions that we are going to have in session 2 with more detail and more, yeah, approaching specific examples that you are already working in. So we think that this is going to be very useful for all of us.
Okay, thank you so much, everyone, and keep send us questions if you have questions or if you need help with DAGIT.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
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 Thank you. It was great.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.